Hey everyone, my name is Elliott Regan, and I'm a front-end developer at Pixel, who's the front row crew over here. And today we're going to be talking about writing ES6 modules you can test. So why start testing code? I feel like this question always comes up. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it because you're all here. I assume you're all slightly interested in testing. There are a few important benefits that I do want to mention. So why start testing code? You can find bugs early, save time for your whole team. The less time, or the fewer bugs your team has to look at, other developers, QA, and everyone else, the faster you guys can get products out there. They also provide, sort of built-in documentation, improve code quality, and you can improve your own understanding of the code that you wrote. The last point is one I want to spend a little more time on. I'm a self-taught developer. I started out my career writing really bad jQuery code, having no idea where jQuery stopped and the browser's built-in functions began. But I was productive, and that's what's most important, especially when you're just making some modals on a brochure site. Eventually, I upgraded to writing really bad AngularJS code, and everything worked like magic. Controllers nested within controllers, nested within controllers, all inheriting and extending a global scope object. It all worked like magic until you had to squeeze a new feature in, and things got a little hairy there. As AngularJS matured, some popular style guides cropped up online, and it helped developers make their code more readable, maintainable, and follow common conventions that eventually helped influence what Angular 2.0 would eventually become. So I leaned on a lot of these best practices because there were developers who were far more experienced than I was writing them, so it must be right. Although there were some strange patterns that kind of came up, and I didn't quite understand what they were for. It's like, for example, instead of using the built-in set timeout method, it was suggested that you use AngularJS's special timeout method. Of course, nothing would stop you from using the built-in set timeout, but for whatever reason, it was best practice to use that timeout. And similarly, AngularJS provided its own window and document objects, and you were discouraged to use the global window and document objects. It wasn't until I started introducing testing into my applications that I began to understand why these are best practices. These days, I don't write much AngularJS code anymore, but when I'm writing vanilla JavaScript or Vue.js, that doesn't mean that all those best practices were learned for naught. A lot of those can be adapted for ES6 modules and Vue.js as well. So, getting started. What do you need to start testing JavaScript? Code to test. An environment to run your tests in, which is either going to be Node.js or a browser. And a testing framework is very, very helpful. Not required technically, but it's very, very helpful. And there are a lot of testing frameworks out there. Depending on the size of your team and the resources you have, you can maybe go for a simple one like ABBA or Tape, or something more complex and flexible like Mocha. It's entirely up to you, and it's something you have to work out with your team. But they all kind of provide similar methods for helping mock things out and get through your tests. So, all right, some different scenarios and how to test them. We're going to go through some utility functions, how to mock globals and what to do with those, and some DOM manipulation stuff. So these are all very common front-end development patterns and requirements, and you should be able to test them. All right. So with a quick show of hands, how many of you guys use ES module syntax in your code today? A little, we'll say about half. How many of you use Common.js syntax? Yeah, less. And how many, I assume the rest of you, put all of your code into one giant JavaScript file?
Legacy.
You guys, yeah, legacy, there you go. Yes. So hopefully that's not the pattern and that's kept the legacy code. But okay, so that's good to know where we all are. We're going to do a quick crash course on ES modules to help understand how they work and the different ways that you use them. So at the bare minimum, this is what it looks like. You have an import module from a path. Then you are able to use that module into anything that's attached to it, such as any functions like that. And then you can export stuff as well. And to give a little more context around that, the idea is that you're, rather than having your giant monolithic file, you're going to want to break things up into small files and group their dependencies together so that you don't have one file importing everything or polluting the global space with jQuery and stuff. So there are two types of exports when you are exporting values. There are default exports and there are named exports. Default exports, you can only have one per module. And it's commonly used for classes where your whole file is going to be a class, or components with a lot of group tightly nested functions. Then you have the named exports, and you can have any number of those per module. And they're ideal for collecting related services. So maybe you have a group of functions for fetching user data, or maybe you have a math module that has a bunch of math utility functions, that kind of stuff. Have you all used Lodash or Underscore? Those are pretty common utility frameworks. So to take a look at what a default export looks like, this is a simple example. In the file sum.js, we are exporting our sum function. And in main.js, we are importing it, then using it to sum 1 and 1 together, which will log 2. And pretty straightforward, simple example there. An interesting characteristic that I want to point out is that by default, or a default export can be named anything. Just because you say import sum from sum.js doesn't mean that you need to call it that. You can call it anything that you want, and it'll work the same way. This can be a handy feature, especially when you're importing functions with the same name from different modules, but it can also be confusing at the same time. So it's just a good characteristic to have, or to be aware of. So now if we take a look at a similar scenario using named exports, if we wrote our sum.js file to export a named export, you'll notice we don't have the default keyword there anymore. But we're going to export it using its name. And then in main.js, we're going to import it using its name as well. We're not able to rename it this way. So it's a little more rigid and predictable, but also it requires the consumer of the module to know the name of that file or of that function. One benefit here is that if you want to export multiple related functions like I was talking about, you can do that. So in this example, we have mathutilities.js, and that's exporting something called sum and difference. And those are two related functions, which can be used, whenever you're doing math. And then in our main.js, we're importing sum from .math utilities. Same idea. Nothing changes down below, only the way that we are. that we export them. One benefit of this is that if you are using a bundler that supports tree shaking optimization, where you can remove parts of your code that you don't use, you cannot tree shake with defaults. You can, however, tree shake with named exports. So in this example, we have sum and difference. Sum is being used, but difference is not. So when our bundler, when it's time to optimize it, it shakes the tree. Difference drops out. It doesn't get compiled with the rest of the code. It's not get shipped to the client. You have a smaller bundle size. So that's one benefit of using named exports. If we try to do that with a default export, you're going to get a syntax error. It can't be done. You have to import the entire module in order to use it if it's a default. All right. Now to make it even more confusing, you can use both named and defaults in the same file. So just because you export a default doesn't mean that you can't export a named export as well. The ES module spec was designed to favor default exports. They're just super easy and concise and predictable. So they allow the other method too, but it was designed to favor the default. And as David Herman put it, ES6 favors the default, the single default export style, and gives the sweetest syntax to import the default. Importing named exports can and should be slightly less concise. So if you are really concerned about your bundle size, if you are importing, Lodash and jQuery and React, maybe you're going to want to pay attention to that and only import the modules that you need. And that's how it does it. So, if you want to spend the time, you can be more verbose. All right, so we made it through that. Now that we've reviewed some of the options that we have for exporting and importing modules, we can start to digest that information into something that will help us better architect our JavaScript code base. By the way, I'm skipping over a few features of imports and exports. There's a lot of small syntax things which ultimately don't change the way that you are going to structure your code base. And it's just something you should talk with your team about and figure out the best way to import and export everything and make sure it's all predictable. So, best practices for ES modules. Keep things flexible and predictable. Using the default export helps with this because you can rename it, and because it only exports one thing, it's easy to know what's going to come out of that module. Of course, the downside of that is that you don't get the benefits of tree shaking, but most of the time, that's an optimization that can come later on. The consumer of your modules will not need to guess the names of the exports or which exports they need to include. They can just pull it all in. It also, if you use only one default, it limits the scope of what you need to be testing in each module. It makes it a little bit easier to digest that and figure out how you should be running your tests. There are scenarios where you'll want to use named exports, tree shaking, for example, and I'll cover a good example of how you can use those two together to make it easy to test and also easy to consume. Yeah, so when planning for tree shaking optimization, use default exports for each module for better testing. So, for example, if we have our math utilities module, and it has sum and difference and a bunch of other math-related functions, break all those smaller functions out into your own module, then import them into one module, which is intended to be consumed. That way, you can start testing the smaller files on their own and not have to deal with everything all in one big export. and it'll make it easier to refactor and move files around later on. So here's a good example from Lodash -ESM, which is the ES module version of the Lodash file library. This is some pseudocode, but essentially what they're doing is they import each, which is one of their functions, one of their utility functions, from each.js. Then they also export, their global object, which becomes, it's tiny, it's shrunk by code. Well, I can't even read that. Well, anyway, I'll explain what it's doing. So, after importing all of its functions, each, its math utilities, all of its data stuff, it'll export one default. That's that first function there, and that's going to include all of Lodash's methods. Then they also export a named export for each one of those functions as well. So if you are concerned about bundle size, you can import just each using the named import. And then if you aren't and you just want all the utilities, because why optimize now when you can optimize later, you can just import Lodash as Lodash. And that tiny bit of text, that's what that's showing, is it's importing the Lodash module as well as each. And then that for each is one of those syntactic things that I mentioned before, those extra features where you can rename objects and stuff like that. So for each is just an alias for each. Yeah. So some common, and for your own code, unless you're building a very large library, generally you don't need to worry about the named exports. It's best to just stick with defaults until you reach the point where you need to worry about the optimization. So, some common scenarios when writing tests. How many of you write tests actively at work in your code? Cool, like about half. Great, so there's some pretty common scenarios that arise all the time. And so there's that. When writing unit tests, you're going to want to control the scope of, in which each of your tests run. So you're going to want to control the values that go in, and you can do that by mocking out dependencies. Suppose you're testing a getUser function, which uses a custom service called HTTP service to reach out to your database. And that HTTP service is, it handles all of your headers and all that stuff, and that is tested separately. We just want to test and look at getUser. It's pretty common to fake HTTP requests from the server because it cuts down on testing time, and you can also define exactly what you're going to get. Maybe you don't have access to the database on your testing server, so you want a user with a specific ID and name and all these other weird test cases that you're going to want to test. So that's when you're going to want to mock out your dependencies like HTTP service. In your tests, you might try to change HTTP service to return a defined user each time. However, ES module imports are read-only. So if you import HTTP service, you cannot modify it. So there's no way to make it spit out a specific user. One of the ways that you can get around that is so it is by setting a local variable, and this is not considered best practice. It's considered kind of an anti-pattern because it means that you're starting to write your code around your test just to get your test to pass. And I only bring it up because it does work, and if you don't want to bring in a testing framework or a library, if you have a simple small project, this is one way to get that done. And again, it's just something that you should talk about with your team and make sure that you all understand why it's being done and that it's the right approach to move forward. So in this case, we're gonna export a main function for testing and a default for consuming for when we are actually using that function in our code. It's a lot of extra code just for tests, and it's not necessarily something we want to deploy in production either. But it does work. A far more common approach is to lean on the wealth of testing tools that are made available to the community. Sino.js is a powerful library that allows you to fake all sorts of data. It's super flexible and works with a bunch of different testing frameworks. The testing framework Jest from Facebook is super simple and easy to set up, and it includes a lot of these methods for mocking data, which could be done by Sinon, or by Jest built-in stuff. So just as an example of how that might be done, we can look at the code. When we're testing do something, it gets user data, and the Sinon.stub means that we are replacing HTTP services get user method with something that we wanted to do. And all the frameworks, I tried to make this somewhat framework agnostic and not get too much into the code because they all kind of have different approaches to it, and it's really, find the tool that's right for your team. All right, so that's mocking dependencies. Mocking globals is next, and globals are something that when you're working with ES modules, you generally want to try to avoid. It's, the point of modules is to encapsulate all of your dependencies, and if you have a bunch of stuff happening in the global scope, it becomes harder to test. You don't know what modified it, and we all probably know what happens with jQuery equivalents and all that. So, yeah, sometimes it's not avoidable, and in those cases, you're going to have to mock those things out. And similar to mocking out dependencies, different testing frameworks are going to offer different ways of testing or of mocking out those globals. Yeah, and so one method is to create very simple mocks that that just go far enough to get your test passing, and and that helps you prevent like a jQuery. If you have to fire off a jQuery function or some other global function, you can mock those out and then not actually have to include that global in your test. But ultimately, when you're working with ES modules, you should try to avoid it. That's a duplicate slide. And then things. So, next up would be mocking DOM manipulation. And for that as well, I don't think that there is a great way to do that without using testing frameworks. This is why it's, you see them everywhere. They are, and each one is going to have a different way of mocking out those methods. One thing to keep in mind when you're mocking out DOM manipulation, sometimes you're going to want to render a small block of your DOM, and then you can test using some framework provided methods to alter those. So without my code blocks, it's not yeah, all right. What's next? All right, I guess I will take questions. Sorry about that, my slides dropped out. Are there any questions?
Do you practice a lot of session development work?
I tried. Part of my goal with this was to jump into it and learn a lot about it and see how I can get it working in smaller projects that don't necessarily have like large testing infrastructure set up and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
What's your favorite testing framework?
So I tried out a few. Jest is pretty great. It includes a bunch of built-in methods for mocking things out. If you're ever setting up Mocha, it's super flexible and you can pull in a lot of different modules to help you out, which can be overwhelming as well. And I think that like some of the newer frameworks that are coming out are trying to keep that all bundled in and make it as easy as possible to get it up and running. Abba is also a very nice one, but that's not quite as full featured as Jest.
Under the assumption that you practice agile methodology, do you factor in writing tests as like how you gauge how many sort of things to get?
Yeah, so I've approached it different ways. When you're doing tester development, you know, if you're waiting on designs or something, you can go very far with writing the test first. And I've found it's a really pleasant way to code, and can work with other departments to get stuff up and running like in an efficient manner. And I think it can be a hard sell too if you're not actively testing. To remember that they generally do save time. Testing infrastructure can definitely be a drain on developer time if you don't have dedicated DevOps for it. But if you do simple tests locally with something like Jest, then I think it's great. Yeah.
Do you recommend testing UI? For example, like checking the existence of a certain button element in the HTML?
Yeah, and that's a lot more complicated. So unit testing, you'll be testing out your modules, and end-to-end testing where you're gonna have to spin up a big browser or a real browser and have it, click it. That becomes a lot more difficult, and I think that you need to make sure you have the support team behind it before going down that path. Yes.
So at what point in your developer career would you start writing testing modules into what you're coding?
As soon as possible. That's one thing that I wish I'd done earlier in my career was starting to write tests. That's when I started to develop a better understanding of the code that I wrote. Even if it's just simple, very simple tests, I think it's a great way to get started.
Is there a good way that you would suggest for someone to get started? Like I just learned the basics of JavaScript last week. So
Great.
That's right.
Yeah, Jest I think is a great one because rather than having to search out different libraries, and it's pretty overwhelming to find all these tools to dig through them. Jest has most of the basics bundled all together, and that's Jest and developed by Facebook. Yeah, you can install it with npm, run the commands with npm, and you can even tie it into Git so that every time you git commit, it'll run the tests, and then you don't end up accidentally committing rote code. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.